I'm the director of the Wits Radio Academy, which is a new institution, a new program within the journalism program at Wits. Wits is one of the oldest and best respected universities in South Africa, but has not had a media program of any substance, a journalism program for very long, which is odd because Johannesburg is really the media capital of the continent. I mean, we probably have more newspapers, radio stations, magazines and journalists than anywhere else on the continent.
How important is community radio to South African broadcasting in general?
It's very important. It's also a child of the new South Africa. Beforehand we had a very restricted radio and generally broadcasting and generally media environment. But after '94 it became possible to start these community radio stations. We now have around 110 licensed stations. It fluctuates quite a lot. Some of them are quite strong, others are very weak. Sometimes they go off air. There are a couple of different kinds. We have campus stations, which is the category that we fall into. We have geographic community stations, which serve mostly very poor communities. And of course, in a sense, that's very exciting because those are communities that are very poorly served by other media. But it's also very difficult to keep going under those circumstances. There are very few, skill levels are low, there's very little money about. Then we have what are called community of interest stations, which are often linked to ethnic communities or religious communities, Muslim stations, Christian stations, Hindu stations. And they tend to do rather better because in most cases there's a bit more money in those kinds of communities than in the others. If you take simply listenership into account, community radio is quite big. I think the weekly listenership is around 6 million. If you took all of those stations together, they would be the second or third largest station in the country. And of course we're a country where there are very large stations. I think the second largest station in the world is here, Ukhozi FM, which belongs to the SABC stable and is a Zulu language station. So there are millions of people who rely on radio, on community radio, for their information and for their education and their entertainment. And of course those audiences are particularly concentrated in disadvantaged areas. Both out in the countryside, where newspapers certainly don't reach, television reaches with difficulty, public radio reaches, community radio is important, and in the poorer communities where people don't have the money to buy other media, community radio is a major source of information. The MDDA is a state institution. It is it's short for the Media Development and Diversity Agency, and it was set up in the aftermath of the media reforms that we had and the political reforms that we had, in order to support community media, both print, radio, and more recently television. We have a handful of community television stations.
Can you tell me about the role of the internet in terms of radio here in South Africa?
Well, as with everywhere, it's become part of the landscape. And most, particularly urban radio stations, have a website and use the website in various ways. Campus stations tend to be quite good at it. I mean, one has to, of course, immediately say that audience usage of the internet, it's a minority pastime. I mean, as everybody knows, South Africa is a very sharply divided country. There are huge differences between rich and poor. The urban elite, the privileged grouping, have internet, broadband generally, and make use of it extensively, use social media to do all those kinds of things. But the overwhelming majority of people don't use it at all. Cell phones are a different matter. Cell phones have huge penetration, but the internet not so much. So obviously that affects the way in which community radio stations relate to the internet. Their audience is not on the internet, so why should they bother? Most of them like the idea. I mean, we run a course here called Radio Goes Online, which is specifically aimed at exploiting the opportunities of the internet environment for radio stations. I mean, I had a station manager who came to that, who said, what's a blog? So, I mean, it just reflects the kind of level of, ignorance is a harsh word, but of just difference. It's a different world for a lot of people. I mean, the mainstream radio stations are using it extensively. Audio streaming is a feature, podcasting is a feature. There's a lot of really interesting kind of interplay between what's on air and what's online. A lot of presenters and DJs are expected to write regular blogs online. There's a lot of effort put into pushing audiences to both platforms. So when you go online, you get prompted to listen. When you're listening, there's a lot of reference to what's going on online. So there's a lot of that kind of activity. Most radio stations use mobile phone technology for SMSs. In other words, they get feedback from audiences in terms of their views of current affairs or music preferences, all that usual kind of thing. And of course, people phone in from mobile phones. In terms of actually putting station output on mobile phones to listen to or to access in some way, there's very little that's been done. There are a couple of experiments. There's one in Grahamstown, which is using mobile phone technology in that way. It's a natural fit, but somehow here at least it hasn't quite been made to work yet, at least on a mass scale. I mean, the devices are there. You can listen on to FM on your radio, on your phone. You can download things off the net onto your phone and listen to it that way. You can use it as an iPod. You can do all these things. But in terms of actually mass, really significant usage, it's not happened yet.
You've looked at radio around the world, I'm sure. You've worked at stations in different countries, different continents. Is there anything in your experience that sets South African radio apart from other radio around the world? Is there anything unique about it or different or original?
Well, one of the features here, I think, is that we still have a landscape that is dominated by full spectrum radio, and that has to do with the languages. I mean, the SABC developed under the years of apartheid for many political reasons these African language stations, which have attracted massive audiences, and they serve everybody from grannies to kids. They manage to mix every conceivable music taste. They do talk, they do phone in, they do drama to some extent, which has disappeared elsewhere, I think, and remains very popular. So in the urban areas, the big cities like Johannesburg, we're niched in the way that the American market is, and in the way that most other European markets are. But out in the countryside, it's not at all niched. We have a small number of very large stations, now augmented by community radio. Now that's one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, is that going to survive? Who knows? I think that the answer to that lies in the kind of overall economic development of the country. But we'll see. But I think that's different. And I suppose what's also unusual is the kind of level of public and official support for community radio. We've spoken about the MDDA, the Department of Communications, which is the government department, has funding programs which puts equipment into community radio station studios. It's not unproblematical because there's always a sort of subtext of let's get our message out there. There is now new legislation on the table which would try to link community stations with local authorities, which is fine if it was a correct professional relationship, but you could just imagine that the municipality of some small town in the Eastern Cape isn't going to miss the opportunity to try and get the mayor's voice on air at great boring length whenever they possibly can. So it's not unproblematical, but I mean there is that kind of support which also does have its good sides. Those are things that I can think of offhand.